Laci Denise Peterson was born on May 4, 1975, née Rocha. She grew up in Modesto, California, known among family and friends as warm, sociable, and outgoing. In her teenage years, she worked as a fitness instructor and had an interest in interior design. She later married Scott Lee Peterson, a native of Bakersfield, California, whom she met in 1997. The couple settled in Modesto, built a home, and were active in their community. In 2002, Laci and Scott announced they were expecting their first child. By December, she was about 8 months pregnant. They named their son to be Connor. To neighbors and acquaintances, they appeared to be a typical middle-class couple looking forward to parenthood. Laci was described by friends as careful, loving, and conscientious. She maintained plans and routines, including daily walks, prenatal doctor visits, regular communication with her husband, and consistency in her social circle. In the weeks before her disappearance, she had purchased baby supplies, attended medical checkups, and seemed on track. In the public AS memory, she is often referenced as a devoted wife and mother, even before Connor's birth. At the time of her death, she was 27 years old and in good health, with a stable job, well loved by family and neighbors, and expecting her future family life to begin imminently. Her husband, Scott, had worked as a fertilizer and seed salesman and did some side fishing work. On Christmas Eve 2002, December 24th, the couple had dined with neighbors and returned home. According to Scott's account, he left early that morning to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina, roughly 90 miles away from their home in Modesto. He said he frequently fished in the San Francisco Bay Area, and that was his alibi for being absent at the time Laci went missing. Friends and family reported no significant marital conflict in public records, though some has pointed later to possible financial and personal pressures in the Peterson household. Neighbors characterized the relationship as congenial. Laci participated in prenatal classes, told friends the baby was due soon, and actively engaged in local social life. In the days just before December 24th, no credible threats or behavior changes were documented. There was no police record of domestic dispute, no restraining orders, no prior complaints of violence. In many ways, Laci seemed like a relatable, everyday American woman with hopes and plans for her family. That normalcy is part of what made her disappearance so shocking and sensational. From the outside, then, Laci Peterson was a young, expectant mother in an ordinary American life. She was looking forward to a milestone in her life. But as events would later show, appearances can mask darkness. In the hours ahead, the trajectory of her life would change in a way no one saw coming. Crime, 800 words. On December 24th, 2002, something went terribly wrong. According to the timeline built by investigators, Laci was last seen alive sometime the evening of December 24th. Neighbors recall she had been around the house, possibly in their front yard, that evening. Scott reported his disappearance only the following morning. At about 10:30 a.m. on December 25th, Scott Peterson placed a call to Modesto police to report Laci missing. He said he had returned home from fishing and found signs that she was gone. He said the front door was unlocked, and the interior of the house showed no obvious signs of forced entry or struggle. He described having last seen her the evening before, and that she had planned to go out to meet a friend that morning. Police responded swiftly. Upon arriving, officers found Laci's purse, keys, and wallet inside the home, undisturbed. Her car was still in the driveway. Inside the house, investigators detected spots of what appeared to be blood on the floor near the master bedroom. A small stain near the rear sliding glass door drew special attention. Investigators also found Laci's car seat folded in the trunk of her car, which was parked right outside. The baby's room was intact, with no obvious signs of disturbance. Meanwhile, Scott mounted an immediate public appeal, appearing on television and asking for help finding his wife. He maintained calm composure and affirmed that something terrible had happened. His alibi, being on the Berkeley Marina fishing, was repeated publicly. Over the next days, as news spread, the case became national. The amount of media attention was extraordinary. Meanwhile, search teams canvassed the area, underwater units inspected nearby water bodies, and police collected physical evidence from the home. They interviewed neighbors, friends, acquaintances, co-workers, even strangers who might have seen anything unusual overnight. As the search broadened, on April 13, 2003, 2 bodies washed ashore near the San Francisco Bay, 1 adult female and 1 fetus approximately matching the gestational age of Connor. The adult remains matched Laci's dental records. Forensic evidence confirmed the fetus was her unborn son, Connor. The location where the bodies were recovered was several miles from Scott's claimed fishing spot, but in the same general Bay area. The cause of death, as determined by pathologists, was consistent with homicide. Laci died by strangulation. The fetus was also evidently killed. The bodies had been in the water for a time, making exact details of time and manner less precise, but enough to affirm that foul play was involved. In the months before that discovery, the investigation had already evolved from a missing person to a presumed homicide. Police had questioned Scott extensively, traced his fishing records, examined phone logs, and focused on his movements. The discovery of the bodies solidified the direction. This was a murder case. Investigators also found that Scott's alibi was weak. The location of bodies and drift models of bay currents raised questions about whether someone could have dumped them in the water in a place reachable from his claimed route. Cell phone records, boat logs, and witness statements were scrutinized. In sum, Laci Peterson's disappearance turned into one of the most heavily publicized homicide cases of the early 2000s. The crime itself, an expectant mother abducted, killed, and dumped at sea, was shocking. The physical evidence at the scene, the struggle over interpretation of the blood traces, and the timing all became matters of deep investigation, laying a foundation for the ensuing legal battle. Discovery, 700 words. This is the part of the story when theory turns into hard evidence. The discovery of 2 bodies in April 2003 brought clarity and new mysteries. On April 13, 2003, a woman walking on a shoreline near San Francisco Bay spotted human remains. The female body and a fetus were recovered from the water. Authorities immediately suspected these might be Laci and her unborn child. Dental records, as well as forensic examination, confirmed the adult body was indeed that of Laci Peterson. The fetus was determined to be her child, Connor. News reports confirmed the remains were badly decomposed, with some erosion attributable to water exposure. The recovery location was several miles from Scott Peterson's claimed fishing area. Experts on ocean currents, tides, and drift trajectories modeled how bodies might move after entering the water. Those drift models helped constrain where a body could have been dumped and still arrive at those shorelines. Upon discovery, police performed a full autopsy. The forensic pathologists concluded that Laci had died by strangulation. The fetus had also died, presumably in relation to the same cause, though water damage complicated some details. The time of death could not be pinpointed precisely, but investigators believed Laci was killed close to her disappearance date. During the months preceding that find, investigators had already begun collecting evidence in Laci's home, interviewing people close to the case, and scrutinizing Scott's statements and alibi. The body discovery gave them both confirmation she was dead and a physical locus for analysis. Inside the Peterson home, the reportedly small bloodstains gathered disproportions in interpretation. Defense claimed the stains were from a nosebleed. Prosecution claimed they matched Laci's DNA and were consistent with injury. Investigators collected swabs and samples. They also collected fibers, fingerprints, and trace evidence. The home had been publicly accessible in the early hours, and contamination was possible. Still, they attempted to preserve what remained. Scott Peterson, in public remarks, expressed shock, sorrow, and uncertainty. He claimed cooperation with investigators. But soon prosecutors began to view him not as a grieving husband, but as a suspect. His behavior, inconsistencies in his statements and certain actions, such as failure to report the disappearance earlier and the weakness of his alibi, drew suspicion. Investigators called in experts to interpret the forensic data: bloodstain analysts, DNA experts, drift models, and more. They also looked at Scott's phone records, his purchases, his financials, his fishing logs, and witness accounts of his movements. The media coverage intensified after the body recovery. Public opinion polarized. Some believed Scott was innocent. Others believed he was guilty almost immediately. The daily press drip of revelations made this case a national obsession. Press conferences, prosecutor updates, and leaks fueled the narrative. Throughout, however, the police emphasized their dedication to following facts. They would not confirm theories prematurely. But behind closed doors, prosecutors were quietly preparing a case. The discovery marked a turning point. No longer speculation, no longer searching. Now they had a crime scene, albeit at sea, evidence to analyze, and a suspect to scrutinize. From here, the investigation would deepen, legal challenges would emerge, and the question was, could they prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt? With Laci's remains recovered, investigators shifted into high gear. The focus turned from what happened to who did it and how can we prove it. The tools: forensic science, behavioral theory, witness interviews, and legal strategy. First, the forensic evidence. Bloodstains inside the Peterson home, though minimal, were swabbed and tested. Experts matched DNA from those stains to Laci. The defense contended the stains came from a nosebleed previously disclosed, but prosecutors argued their location and pattern were consistent with injury. There was also the analysis of fibers, trace materials, and possible transfer evidence. Second, ballistics and fishing records. Investigators traced Scott's fishing route. They examined his boat logs, fuel receipts, cell phone data, and witness statements to verify distance and timeline from the Berkeley Marina trip. They compared drift models to estimate how bodies dumped in various locations would move in water currents to the spot where Laci A.S.'s body was found. Those models suggested certain putative dump points were more plausible than others. Third, witnesses and co-workers. People who worked with Scott or knew him were interviewed. Some reported that he had asked about boating and tides. Others said he discussed possible routes. Investigators also looked for anyone who might have seen Scott moving or acting suspiciously at odd hours, or exiting the water or landing sites. Neighbors were asked if they saw any vehicles near canals or waterfront zones in the early morning hours. Fourth, phone and financial records. Investigators subpoenaed Scott's phone logs to track movements and communications. They examined his credit card and bank activity, seeking odd purchases or expenses inconsistent with his claim. They also re-examined whether he had anomalies or gaps in his history that suggested deception. Fifth, behavioral and psychological analysis. Prosecutors and their expert consultants studied Scott's demeanor, his decisions, for example, waiting hours before calling authorities, and the pattern of his public appeals. Some experts opined that his public composure was too controlled, virtually theatrical. Others cautioned drawing too strong a conclusion from demeanor. Still, prosecutors used that to question whether his grief was genuine or opportunistic. Sixth, defense counter-investigation. Scott's defense team sought to discredit the evidence, offer alternate theories, e.g., an intruder, challenge the drift model assumptions, argue contamination of blood evidence, and highlight gaps in the prosecution's chain of custody. They put forward alternate dump locations and claimed some prosecution experts were speculative. They also highlighted possible weaknesses in police procedure, candor in the timeline, possible contamination of the house crime scene, delay of certain forensic tests, and possible investigative tunnel vision. During depositions and discovery, the defense gained access to police interview transcripts, forensic reports, and internal memoranda. They filed pretrial motions to suppress or limit evidence, for example, arguments that some searches required warrants, or that handling of evidence was flawed. Prosecutors responded with submissions defending chain of custody and admissibility. A key moment came when prosecutors presented their theory of the crime, that Scott Peterson, likely on December 24th or early morning December 25th, killed his wife at their home, then transported her body by boat onto the San Francisco Bay, dumped it into the water, and relied upon drift and tide to carry it to where it was found. The theory held that Scott's alibi was false or exaggerated, and that timing and physical evidence supported it. Defense critics attacked various assumptions, that the bloodstain could be explained otherwise, that drift models are inherently speculative, and that evidence at sea degrades too much for firm conclusions. They posed alternative dump sites, questioned drift direction, and challenged forensic interpretations. Prosecutors rebutted by using multiple models of drift, corroborating witness statements, re-examining Scott's logs and phone data, and cross-examining defense expert assumptions. They argued that the accumulation of evidence, blood, motion, timing, behavior, constructed a coherent narrative. One legal milestone came with the admissibility of expert testimony. The trial court held hearings, so-called Daubert or Kelly hearings, to determine whether the drift models, blood pattern analyses, and expert inferences would be allowed in the trial. The court admitted much of it, though under scrutiny. That decision shaped what jurors would eventually see. As the preparatory stages concluded, prosecutors and defense exchanged proposed voir dire questions, jury instructions, and exhibit lists. They deposed key witnesses and experts. Investigative teams rehearsed courtroom strategy. The prosecution pressed for a relentless focus on the accumulating evidence, hoping to overwhelm the defense's attempts to sow doubt. One tension point: how much the prosecution would rely on inference over direct proof. Because some parts of the crime happened at sea and the timeline had gaps, the case inherently involved reconstructive science, models, interpolation, timing assumptions. The defense emphasized that any one assumption being wrong could collapse the chain. The prosecution insisted the total convergence of independent lines of evidence made the case strong. Heading into trial, the investigators believed they had established a plausible, though not airtight, account. The evidence would now live or die in the courtroom under cross-examination, jury scrutiny, and legal rules of proof. Arrest. Before trial, prosecutors sought to indict and bring Scott Peterson to justice. They prepared a charging document laying out counts of homicide against Laci and homicide of the unborn child, Connor. In July 2003, a Stanislaus County grand jury indicted Scott on 2 counts: first-degree murder of Laci Peterson with special circumstances, and second-degree murder of the unborn child. The special circumstances allegation, which can permit aggravated sentencing, was based on murder of multiple victims, the fetus and the mother. The indictment formally charged him with both murders, plus special circumstances. His arrest was made public, and he was taken into custody. Upon arrest, Scott maintained his innocence and asserted he would vigorously defend himself. He was arraigned in Superior Court, entered a plea of not guilty, and bail was set high. His defense team, drawn from high-profile criminal attorneys, began immediate preparations, obtaining all discovery and filing pretrial motions, including motions to suppress or exclude evidence, e.g. challenging drift models, forensic assumptions, chain of custody of blood samples, admissibility of expert testimony, and pretrial publicity impacts. Prosecution, in turn, prepared motion responses, refining their arguments for admissibility and seeking to block some defense attacks. Both sides began intense jury research, looking for jurors without bias in a case that would attract press attention. Scott Peterson's public persona during this time was heavily managed. He appeared at press conferences, professed heartbreak, and repeatedly affirmed cooperation with law enforcement. He also criticized media sensationalism. The media followed every twist: leaks, defense filings, local reactions, and protests. In pretrial phases, a major concern was venue and change of venue. Defense sought to move the trial away from Modesto or Stanislaus County, arguing that pretrial publicity would taint jurors. Prosecutors resisted, citing community interest. Ultimately, the trial remained in Stanislaus County, albeit with heightened jury screening to ensure impartiality. Before trial began, motions in limine determined which evidence the jury would see. The court ruled, for instance, that prosecution's expert drift testimony, and the admissibility of bloodstain analysis were allowed, though subject to cross-examination. The defense did not prevail in suppressing those core pieces. A crucial risk for the defense was prejudicial publicity. Newspapers and TV stations ran dramatic stories about the missing pregnant mom, speculation about motive, interviews with neighbors, and psychological character sketches of Scott. Defense counsel attempted to instruct jurors to avoid media and follow the law, the standard approach. But the flood of coverage made that difficult. Some prospective jurors had already formed opinions or had heard rumors. The voir dire phase had to dig deeply, try to root out bias, and challenge potential jurors on prior exposure to the case. Still, both sides readied for battle. Prosecutors refined their narrative into a tight opening statement, laying out the timeline, forensic evidence, drift model theory, and behavior of the defendant, and believed jurors would be persuaded by cumulative weight, even where direct evidence was lacking. Defense prepared a counter-narrative, that the prosecution's theory rested on speculative reconstructions, that evidence was contaminated or misinterpreted, and that reasonable doubt remained. On March 3, 2004, the jury trial officially began in Stanislaus County Superior Court before Judge Alfred DeLucchi. This marked the transition from investigation to courtroom contest. The fight would be data, testimony, cross-examination, and jury persuasion. From opening statements to closing arguments, the trial was a painstaking contest of logic, science, credibility, and narrative persuasion. Opening statements set the tone. Prosecutors told jurors they would prove beyond reasonable doubt that Scott Peterson murdered Laci, then disposed of her and Connor's bodies in San Francisco Bay. They previewed major evidence, matching bloodstains, expert drift models, phone logs, inconsistencies in Scott's stories, and behavior. The defense's opening stressed uncertainty, the prosecution's reliance on models, gaps in direct proof, possible alternative explanations, and the burden of proof resting entirely with the state. Next came prosecution case-in-chief. Witnesses included forensic pathologists who testified about cause of death, strangulation, condition of remains, and evidence the fetus died in relation. DNA and bloodstain analysts who connected blood swabs in the Peterson home to Laci's DNA. Drift model and oceanographic experts who explained how bodies dumped in certain bay areas might drift to the recovery spot over time. Phone and cell tower experts who tracked Scott's cell calls and possible movement in proximity to waterways. Witnesses from boating and fishing community who testified about possible routes, tides, and docking areas. Neighbors or acquaintances who testified about behavior or statements by Scott. Questions, fishing-related remarks, or movements inconsistent with his story. Throughout cross-examination, defense attorneys attacked each expert's assumptions, methodology, margin of error, and whether it was properly based on validated science. They challenged whether drift modeling was speculative, whether bloodstains might come from a nosebleed or other innocent cause, and noted any inconsistencies or uncertainties in expert testimony. In rebuttal, prosecutors called some additional witnesses or returned experts to clarify points or respond to defense critiques. Following that, the defense case presented witnesses and alternative theories. Defense experts attacked drift models, proposed alternative dump sites, and suggested less dramatic explanations for bloodstain evidence. They questioned chain of custody issues and potential contamination. They challenged assumptions about tidal flows, time of death estimates, and the integrity of evidence handled early by police. The defense also presented character witnesses who testified to Scott's personality, reputation, honesty, and lack of prior violence. They sought to humanize him as a husband and father, not a murderer. In cross-examination of prosecution witnesses, defense attorneys probed inconsistencies, challenged assumptions, and tried to create doubt, especially around any point where the prosecution's scientific or technical testimony relied on inference rather than absolute certainty. After both sides rested, closing arguments became the final battleground. Prosecutors argued that the case was not dependent on one single irrefutable fact, but on the convergence of multiple, independent lines of evidence that reinforced one another. They argued the totality of the evidence left no reasonable alternative. Defense counsel countered that the hypothetical science-based reconstructions were speculative, that there remained unanswered questions and plausible alternative explanations, and that the burden of proof had not been met. They emphasized reasonable doubt. If a juror found a single foundational assumption weak, the entire chain might collapse. Judge DeLucchi instructed the jury on legal standards. They must acquit if any reasonable doubt remained. That inference was allowed only when logically compelled, and that evidence must be weighed carefully. He also limited what jurors could consider about pre-trial publicity or media reports. Deliberation followed. The jury retired to deliberate for several days. Outside, media and public attention was intense. Many believed the case was close. Some media commentators predicted a conviction. Others cautioned the uncertainties of the scientific reconstructions. Finally, the jury returned a verdict on November 12, 2004. On count 1, first-degree murder of Laci Peterson, the jury found Scott Peterson guilty. On count 2, second-degree murder of the unborn child Connor, they also found him guilty. The special circumstances allegation was affirmed. The verdict carried significant consequences. First-degree murder with special circumstances could allow eligibility for the death penalty under California law. The courtroom reaction ranged from shock to relief. Prosecutors praised the jury for seeing through complexity to truth. The defense immediately filed motions for judgment notwithstanding the verdict, JNOV, and new trial, arguing errors in admission of evidence, expert testimony, and jury instructions. Those motions were denied. The case advanced to sentencing. In March 2005, Scott Peterson was sentenced to death for the murder of Laci, under California's capital sentencing scheme. He also received a concurrent sentence for Connor's death. The death sentence placed him on death row in California. Aftermath. In the years after trial, the Peterson case continued to generate legal, social, and cultural ripples. The issues included appeals, debates over forensic science, media influence, and larger questions about inference in criminal prosecution. Appeals and post-conviction proceedings dominated much of Scott's life behind bars. His defense pursued appeals on multiple grounds: challenges to jury instructions, expert testimony, pretrial publicity's impact, admission of drift model science, and chain of custody or procedural errors. Over time, the case went through multiple rounds of judicial review in California's appellate system and federal habeas corpus proceedings. In 2020, the California Supreme Court vacated the death sentence, citing issues in jury instructions and potential prejudice from improper jury selection and passion appeal arguments. The court ordered a new penalty retrial. That decision underscored how fragile capital sentencing can be, especially in a case so high-profile and technically complex. In the retrial of penalty phase, prosecutors sought to reinstate a death penalty or select another severe sentence. In December 2021, the resentencing resulted in life imprisonment without possibility of parole. That is, Scott would remain imprisoned for life, with no death sentence. Throughout, public and media discourse remained intense. Some viewed Peterson as definitively guilty. Others saw him as a victim of prosecutorial overreach or forensic over-reliance. Critics of the case point to how models, assumptions, and inference played a central role, a pattern seen in other high-profile cases. Supporters of the verdict argue that the totality of the evidence overcame doubt. The case also illuminated ethical questions about media and justice. From day one, media coverage was relentless. Local and national news outlets saturated the airwaves with commentary, speculation, leaks, and interviews. The defense repeatedly argued that pre-trial publicity made fair trial difficult. Jurors were heavily questioned during voir dire to avoid bias. Over time, many commentators have criticized how media framing may shape public opinion, influence prosecutorial decisions, and even seep into juror attitudes subconsciously. Another enduring question: forensic uncertainty and inference. The Peterson case is often cited in academic critiques of how courts accept drift modeling, Bayesian inference, and scientific reconstruction. Some legal scholars argue the case illustrates how circumstantial evidence may carry undue weight when presented confidently, even though each individual assumption may carry uncertainty. The Peterson case also had an emotional legacy. The family of Laci and Connor have maintained their memory through advocacy, foundation work, and public statements. For many, the verdict represented closure, or at least a measure of justice. For others, lingering doubts or appeals kept the case alive in public consciousness. In the correctional system, Scott Peterson remains incarcerated. His status, appeals, and conditions have periodically drawn media stories, though none have shaken the core conviction. On the legal side, the case is now studied in law schools, forensic courses, and criminal procedure classes for the lessons it offers, both about prosecution strategy and defense pitfalls. It remains a cautionary example of how a case built largely on inference must withstand rigorous cross-examination and appellate scrutiny. Culturally, public fascination with the case led to television documentaries, books, true crime podcasts, dramatizations, and commentary. The story resonated because it combined elements people fear: an expectant mother, betrayal, waterborne disappearance, and because it appeared to hinge on bridging gaps of uncertainty with scientific bravado. Yet after all these years, some questions remain. Could an external actor, intruder scenario still be plausible? Were all defense criticisms fully addressed? Did peer jurors truly grasp the limits of inference? Did media shape the contours of the case more than law? These unresolved threads overlay the legal finality. More than 2 decades after Laci and Connor's disappearance and murder, the Peterson case still echoes through law, journalism, and public consciousness. It leaves behind a legacy of lessons, debates, and cautionary reminders. First, the power and peril of inference-based prosecution. The prosecution in this case did not rely on a smoking gun or eyewitness. Instead, it built a structure of interlocking inferences: bloodstain patterns, drift models, timing, behavioral indicators, and inconsistencies in the defendant's narrative. That approach can be powerful, but it also exposes vulnerability. If one assumption is undermined, the entire chain wobbles. Legal educators now use this case as a paradigm of balance: how to responsibly admit expert models, how to frame inferences for jurors, and how to calibrate reasonable doubt in complex technical cases. Second, media, trial, and public perception. From the start, the Peterson case became a media spectacle. Every twist was broadcast, dissected, and magnified. The defense raised venue change and juror bias concerns. The flood of commentary risked prejudgment. The case shines light on how modern true crime coverage can influence the atmosphere of trial, juror psychology, and public assumptions. It cautions against equating media narratives with courtroom truth and warns of the risk of trial by media. Third, evolving capital punishment jurisprudence. The reversal of the death sentence in 2020 and subsequent life sentence underscored how errors in jury instruction, emotional argument, or failure to mitigate prejudice can derail even a high-profile conviction. That journey illustrates how the criminal justice system must maintain checks, particularly in death penalty cases. It reaffirms the principle that procedural fairness and appellate scrutiny are not secondary. They are essential when life is on the line. Fourth, forensics, science, and their limits. The case remains a cautionary tale about the limits of reconstructive science. Drift models rely on variables, currents, tides, wind, that are inherently probabilistic. Bloodstain analysis, especially on small amounts or degraded specimens, must account for contamination, alternate sources, and error margins. The case underscores that expert testimony must transparently acknowledge assumptions, limitations, and sensitivity to change. Courts and juries must distinguish between confident rhetoric and overreach. Fifth, impact on cold case methodology and investigative standards. Investigators in later cold cases sometimes look back at Peterson's case as a benchmark: how to collect and preserve trace evidence, how to model environmental conditions, how to integrate scientific modeling with traditional detective work. Some argue that initial crime scene preservation, early bloodstain documentation, and contamination control are critical lessons learned from this and similar high-stakes cases. Sixth, victim advocacy and memory. The deaths of Laci and Connor were deeply tragic, and their memory continues in the hearts of family, friends, and communities disturbed by the loss. Their case became not just legal matter, but human drama. The story of a life cut short, of a community unsettled, of a family seeking closure. For many people, the verdict offers some measure of justice, even knowing some doubts persist. Yet the legacy is not unambiguous. Some still argue that Scott Peterson's case relied too heavily on speculative inference, and that reasonable doubt remains under-examined by the public. Others maintain the verdict was correct, and that combining multiple lines of evidence created a compelling picture far beyond guesswork. For the broader public, the Peterson case helped shape how Americans understand true crime documentaries, forensics, and criminal procedure. It taught audiences to question the certainty of reconstructive science, to ask how media shapes narrative, and to see beyond dramatic headlines into the messy, contested world of evidence, cross-examination, and reasonable doubt. In that sense, the Peterson case lives on, not just as a closed legal matter, but as a story of how we adjudicate truth in complex technical cases, how the law wrestles with uncertainty, and how justice must constantly guard against overconfidence. It remains, after all these years, a cautionary mirror for media, courts, and citizens, a reminder that in the shadows between fact and inference, the cause of justice demands humility, rigor, and awareness of limits. Conclusion. The case of Laci and Connor Peterson is not just a murdered family, it is a meditation on how modern criminal justice grapples with the unknown, the inferential, and the probabilistic. From the disappearance, the heartbreaking wait, the recovery of remains in the bay, the labyrinth of drift models and bloodstains, to the high-stakes courtroom contest, this was never a simple case. It was a challenge. Could a state convict not on a single definitive proof, but on many lines of evidence weaving a coherent narrative? Yes, the jury believed it could. They found Scott Peterson guilty of both murders. The courts affirmed that conviction, and later resentenced him to life without parole after death penalty reversal. And yet, after decades, some questions still persist. Could alternative theories, intruder, dump by other, evidence misinterpretation, still be worth a second glance, at least in the public mind? Did media frenzy distort perceptions or put pressure on the courtroom's margins? Did the jury truly appreciate the uncertainties embedded in scientific models? And when prosecutors weave a tapestry of inference, do we risk mistaking sophistication for certainty? Justice, in this case, means a verdict upheld by law. But justice also invites reflection on how forensic science should be presented, how jurors should be instructed about inference and doubt, and how media should responsibly cover such delicate matters. The Peterson case remains both a closed chapter and an open lesson. Closed in that a conviction stands, open in that debates about method, fairness, and narrative persist. For audiences who consume crime documentaries, the Peterson story reminds us the most dramatic mysteries often resolve not in sudden climaxes, but in the slow accumulation of evidence, examined under relentless scrutiny. The shadows between what we can know and what we infer are where responsibility must lie, in expert testimony, cross-examination, judicial gatekeeping, and juror understanding. In the end, justice was delivered according to law, but the legacy is as much about how we deliver justice, how we balance certainty and humility, how we guard against overreach, and how we respect both victims and defendants in that delicate balance. The Peterson case will continue to challenge, instruct, and provoke for as long as we seek to hold wrongdoers accountable in a world bounded by uncertainty.